All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So, welcome to the afternoon session of the colloquium in honor of John. First talk today is by David Pitt. David Pitt's a professor at Cal State LA. He is currently working and finishing a book called The Quality of Thought, which is under contract with OUP, so look out for that. He's published numerous articles, including Indexical Thought in the Uriah Kriegel Phenomenal Intentionality volume and The Phenomenology of Cognition, or What It's Like to Think That P, philosophy in the PPR back in 2004 now. And just so you know, I wasn't lying about the music thing. What is tonality in the International Journal of Musicology? So please join
It's
me in
actually my first publication.
Yes, yes. So please join me in welcoming David Pitt. He's going to be talking today on analytic phenomenology.
Thank you, and thank you, David, very much for inviting me to participate. Again, I'm sorry I never got to meet John, but I think I would have really liked him, and I think we would have had a great deal to talk about. We were in agreement about a lot of stuff. Actually, when I gave an early version of the Phenomenology of Cognition paper at APA in Los Angeles, and I was on, my abstract was on the program, and I got an email from Terry. I don't know if you remember this, that you were excited and you said, yeah, we're thinking along the same lines. Can you send me the draft? And then when your paper came out in 2002, it became even clearer to me that, yeah, we were really thinking the same sorts of things about a lot of these issues. I mean, your paper with John covered a lot more ground. Mine was much more narrowly focused. But he certainly was a kindred spirit. So what I'm reading here is, in large part, the first chapter of the book. And so I'm very eager to have comments. Brandon's written comments that I'll respond to have been really helpful. They made me rethink some stuff. So here goes. Husserlian, how do you say it? Husserlian phenomenology sets aside or brackets the question of the existence of a mind-independent world and its relation to our experience in order to focus on experience itself as we have it from the first-person perspective. Husserl's motivation for doing this was, in part, to evade vexed questions concerning the relationship of perceptual experience to the world, which so preoccupied philosophers from Descartes to Kant. What I'm calling analytic phenomenology sets aside the problematic relation between experience and the brain in order to study experience independently of the metaphysical issues that have long preoccupied analytic philosophers of mind. This phenomenology is analytic because it brings the methodology of analytic philosophy to bear on the study of experience per se. Is to be distinguished from the study of Husserl and the extension of his ideas pursued by contemporary analytically inclined philosophers such as Hubert Dreyfus, Dagfinn Follestall, J.N. Mohanty, David Woodruff Smith, and Dan Zahavi. It finds its inspiration not in Husserl's work, but in dissatisfaction with analytic philosophy of mind, which it sees as having been, since its inception, too narrowly focused on ontology, and for not especially good reasons. While not denying the interests or significance of the mind-body problem, analytic phenomenology, my version, insists that an explanation of experience in non-experiential terms is not the only, or indeed the most important, profitable, or interesting project to pursue in the philosophical study of mind. To obsess over the ontological status of experience is to miss most of the interesting questions about it. It's like neglecting mathematics because you're hung up on the question of what numbers are. From the perspective of analytic phenomenology, whether or not experience can be reductively explained now or even ever is irrelevant. Experience, whatever it is, and whatever its precise relation to neural activity, undeniably exists. We're directly aware of its existence in having it. We can't tell whether it's a physical phenomenon or not from the first-person perspective, though it certainly seems to be radically different from everything else that gets called physical. But we don't need to know this in order to investigate it on its own terms. We can come to understand a great deal about its nature from the subjective point of view, not in the bare ontological sense of knowing what kind of thing it is, but in the richer sense of knowing what it is in itself, its varieties, its structure, its scope, etc. Moreover, analytic phenomenology sees the assumption that experience must be ultimately explicable in naturalistic terms, for example, in those of present physics or some conservative extension of it, and the ceding of ontological and methodological authority to empirical science as intrusive and stifling. In this, it perhaps shares one of Husserl's motivations. Even if neuroscientists were eventually to figure out how experience arises in the brain, it would not be the case that only then would we have come to understand it, because only then would we have determined what it really is. We already know what it really is, even if it's difficult to describe it, independently of anything we know about the brain. And we would not only then have validated experience as a respectable phenomenon, worthy, like chemical and biological phenomena, of its own serious field of inquiry. Chemistry and biology would be perfectly legitimate sciences, even if reality had turned out to be structured the way the British emergentists thought it was. Reducibility to basic physics cannot be the fundamental principle of ontological legitimacy or the fundamental condition of adequacy on explanation of any phenomenon. We must, in the first place, take things as we find them. Perhaps one day in the distant future, we'll have stopped discovering new things, and everything we've discovered will have been shown to be reducible to, or to super-duper-vene, to use Terry's term, on basic physics as presently understood, or some conservative extension of it. But we should not assume that this must happen, and we should not let this assumption determine in advance what can count as really real, or what is a genuinely scientific hypothesis, or what kind of methodology is legitimate. We can't really know if physicalism, that is the view that everything in the universe is unified under one basic kind, the fundamental nature of which physics has already given us a firm grasp of, is true until we finish explaining everything. Indeed, I don't think even physicists themselves assume that physicalism in this sense is or must be true. Newton took a non-conservative leap when he introduced gravitational force. And quantum mechanics has shown how far physicists are prepared to go in order to accommodate evidence. I don't see why physicists should balk at the possibility that the best explanation for some phenomenon might be in terms of previously non-physical objects or properties, primitively causally related to the ones we already know about. I suspect that philosophers of mind who do assume physical reduction as a criterion of adequacy on a theory of experience are so impressed or embarrassed by the success of empirical science so far, for example, the reduction of biology to chemistry and chemistry to physics, that they think only empirical science can give us substantive knowledge about reality, and hence that philosophy should take a back seat to it. This might lead someone to insist, a la Fodor, that if experience is something real, it really must be something else, that is, something physical, just like all the other real phenomena out there, just like physics tells us. But I think this is bad philosophy of physics, and that we're better off putting the assumption aside when doing philosophy of mind. We have the phenomenon itself right above our noses, and we have a basic introspective methodology. Philosophers of mind should neither wait upon science to explain how experience is just another natural phenomenon, nor fetishize its methodology and results in search of legitimacy. What they need to do, the analytic phenomenologist insists, is first of all, to stop worshiping empirical science and obsessing about ontology, and learn to love experience as we have it, whatever it turns out to be. We stand to make much better progress in our understanding of it if we free ourselves of what Charles Seward has so memorably called, quote, the tyrannizing anxieties and ambitions of mind-body metaphysics, unquote. All that said, in advocating for a first-person first methodology of the study of experience, I don't mean to suggest that our intimacy with it and our certainty of its existence entails omniscience or infallibility with respect to our judgments about it. Though I do think that how it appears to us is necessarily the way it is, since for experience, appearing simply is occurring, and occurring is existing. It might be quite difficult in some cases due to limitations of memory, attention, or conceptual resources, for example, to determine precisely what those facts are. And there's no reason to deny the relevance or importance of empirical methodology to the study of experience. But empirical study of the brain and central nervous system can neither be the starting point nor the sine qua non of a science of the mind. It's relevant only insofar as it can help us understand experience, which is not open to objective scrutiny. Disciplined introspection sets the task for neuroscience, not vice versa. If we abandon or demote the first-person perspective, we will not come to understand experience, because in doing so, we will be, as Nagel would put it, studying something else. Analytic phenomenology is in part a reaction to the narrow conception of what it is to explain a phenomenon that has dominated analytic philosophy of mind. But it's also a response to the abject failure of reductive philosophical theories to shed any light on experience and phenomenality, or any of the other mental phenomena such as intentionality, thought, and perception, which it claims cannot be adequately explained or explained at all in wholly non-experiential terms. Some philosophers have simply ignored experience. Only behavioral dispositions are psychological. Some have tried to explain it away, it's an illusion, or diminish its importance, doesn't do anything. Some have even denied its existence outright, which I think is a stunningly perverse move only a philosopher would even consider. Galen Strawson has called the denial of the existence of consciousness, quote, the great silliness, capitalized, the greatest silliness in the history of philosophy, the greatest silliness in the whole history of human thought. I concur, and I find illusionism equally risible. More reasonable thinkers have taken experience seriously, but have tried to show how it is really something else, a brain process, a higher order functional property, a representational relation to things in the world, etc. That is something easier to study using current empirical methodology. However, all of these can exist without any experience at all of these things that are studied. So none of these theories can give us an adequate account of it, even by the lights of their own narrow notion of explanation. It's clear that none of these things is identical to experience, and nothing in the theories tells us why any of them should result in it. Nor, I think, is illumination forthcoming from neuroscience. In spite of all the evidence that experience is the result of neural activity, no one has the slightest idea how this is possible, much less an explanation of how it actually happens. We have correlations, but not a shred of understanding of what the correlated phenomena could possibly have to do with each other. For all the brilliant achievements of the sciences of the brain, the organs of sensation, and their connection, we're not one step closer to understanding what any of this has to do with experience. Indeed, the more detail we're provided by empirical neuroscience, the more ridiculous the whole thing seems. The language of the brain is action potentials. And action potentials are a difference in electric charge across neuronal membranes, which are propagated from one neuron to another, either directly or via the intervention of neurotransmitters, which are amino acids, peptides, and other complex chemicals. Any differences among external stimuli, which include photons, compression waves, tastings, odorants, pressure, temperature, are completely obliterated by transducers in our sensory organs, whose function it is to respond to stimuli by producing or suppressing action potential. It's common, at least in non-technical presentations, to speak of impinging stimuli being transformed or converted into action potentials. Compression waves, for example, can no more be transformed into electrical impulses than light could be transformed into ice cream. You might build a machine that extrudes ice cream in response to amplitude or frequency of electromagnetic radiation in the visual range. But this doesn't count as the transformation of light into ice cream. No trace of the different intrinsic properties of the stimuli survives transduction into action potentials, and only differ with respect to their frequency and velocity. Sensory transduction can get very complicated, as for example in the phototransduction cascade, the seemingly monstrously inefficient multi-step process whereby the impact of a photon on a molecule in a retinal receptor, a rod or cone, results in the production of an action potential in a bipolar cell, or the equally baroque, but I think very beautiful, process by which lateral compression waves heating the eardrum results in the generation of action potentials in the hair cells in the organ of Corti. But action potentials are action potentials. They're the same for any neuron. Differences in electrical potential across cell membranes are due to the influx and efflux of ions. Our sensory receptors are like simple doorbells. They produce the same response no matter what sets them off, the same kind of response. Moreover, differences in neural activity within the brain seem to amount to no more than differences in location, frequency, and pattern. Action potentials from bipolar cells in the retina are propagated along pathways that end up here, and from the hair cells in the inner ear here, from the mitral and tufted cells in the olfactory bulb there, etc., etc. But why should where the neurons are firing have anything to do with the differences between visual, auditory, olfactory, etc. experience? The firings are all the same, and any patterns of such firings within the brain are just patterns of occurrence of these chemical reactions. How could differences in what really amounts to virtual current flow in neurons explain the profound qualitative differences between, say, visual and auditory experience? Neuroscientists sometimes talk about the brain interpreting and deciding things, but these can only be metaphors. Nor, it seems, can we appeal to differences in the intrinsic properties of neurotransmitters to account for experiential differences. Differences in chemical composition and structure seem as unrelated to experiential differences as differences in current flow. Moreover, intrinsic differences among neurotransmitters suffer the same fate as intrinsic differences in external stimuli. Receptor proteins in postsynaptic neurons are also transducers, responding to in the same kinds of ways, that is, promotion and inhibition of action potential, all of them. They're more simple doorbells. Neither philosophy nor neuroscience has made a dent in the mind-body problem, which, in my view, comes to this in a slogan. There's overwhelming empirical evidence that neural activity in the brain is responsible for experience, which is impossible. I, for one, would not understand how it works if God tweeted us all the explanation. To me, it would be like being told by God that 2 + 3 = Neptune, or that there's a reductive explanation of sound in terms of color. I suppose we'd all have to believe it. God is, after all, no deceiver, but we, at least I, wouldn't understand it. It's possible this is just my problem, but I doubt it. Maybe Colin McGinn is right that the psychophysical nexus is unintelligible to us for the same kind of reason the integral calculus is unintelligible to antelopes. Or maybe it's for the same kind of reason calculus is unintelligible to human infants or early Homo sapiens. We can in principle grasp it, just not yet. In any case, I think what's left for a philosopher to do, if only in the meantime, is to try to understand experience on its own terms, while remaining steadfastly agnostic about its relation to physical reality. Mind-body metaphysics is, for the foreseeable future, a mug's game. Better to focus on giving an account of how experience in all of its varieties constitutes a mind, and how our minds present the world to us. This latter is the ambition of the chapter of analytic phenomenology that has come to be called the Phenomenal Intentionality Research Program, or just Phenomenal Intentionality. The project is to characterize perception and cognition as we have them from the first-person perspective in phenomenal terms. There is something it's like to have a mind. In particular, something it's like to perceive and to think, to be presented with a world and to apply concepts to it. Insofar as mentality is constituted by perceiving and thinking, then, it's essentially an experiential phenomenon existing only in the experiential moment, to borrow from Galen again. The phenomenal intentionality research program has two main branches, corresponding to the two main kinds of intentionality we possess. It's traditional to distinguish sensitive and cognitive aspects of the mind, or its sentience and sapience, and the analytic tradition has assumed that these are metaphysically distinct. Sensation is essentially non-intentional, and cognition is essentially non-phenomenal. This is the separatism that Terry and John talk about. I think actually perception itself might be some kind of, perception as opposed to just sensation might be some kind of hybrid of the two. This sharp distinction of these two aspects of mind is typically denied by, by participants in the phenomenal intentionality research program. They claim that sensational properties themselves have intentionality. I think here of Brian Lohr's description of pure sensation as mental paint that purports to point. So the participants in the phenomenal intentionality research program claim that sensational properties themselves have intentionality, that sensational intentionality is essential for perception, and that conceptual intentionality is constituted by a sui generis kind of experience, understanding experience, or cognitive phenomenology, which, as I said earlier today, I now prefer to call conceptual or propositional phenomenology. Intentionality is, originally and essentially, a mental phenomenon. We don't have a mind-independent conception of it that conceptual representations must somehow measure up to, any more than we have a conception of a world of perceivable objects that precedes our experience of them that perceptual representations have to capture. The very idea of intentionality, like the very idea of a world of perceivable objects, arises from our direct experience of it. Intentional states are not theoretical entities. Moreover, since linguistic intentionality is derived from mental intentionality and not vice versa, theorizing about the semantics of natural languages should be constrained by facts about the concepts and thoughts natural language expressions are used to express. It is therefore, in my view, a mistake to base a theory of linguistic meaning on an account of how language is used in communication, as for example Grice does. Meaning is not a third-person phenomenon. What expressions mean is grounded in what thinkers mean by them, which is in turn grounded in what thinkers think. And it's independent of expressions being put to use by anyone for any purpose, and independent of considerations concerning how a speaker is to be interpreted by someone else in various circumstances. What semantics is really about is the structure and content of thought. And a successful semantic theory must answer to the facts about them. Thought is not language-like. Language is thought-like. Intuitions about the use of natural language expressions and the interpretation of speech acts cannot be the foundation for theorizing about mental or linguistic content. Dretske was almost the Darwin of intentionality. His insight that causal relations, insofar as they carry information about the occurrence of the events they relate, establish a kind of proto-intentionality, is, I think, simple and profound. Though not yet what we have, this proto-intentionality is sufficiently like it to get us a conceptual foot in what seemed to be the unopenable door between this feature of the mind and our physical constitution. Dretke's idea promised to show how it's possible that a highly sophisticated and puzzling aspect of our mentality could arise from simple natural beginnings by entirely natural processes. This had a significant impact on the philosophy of mind. Jerry Fodor went so far as to claim that, quote, Turing and Dretske had between them solved the mind-body problem. Turing showed how a physical thing could reason, and Dretske showed how a physical thing could represent. There was still the problem of conscious qualitative experience, which causal relations per se don't seem qualified to explain, as Fodor in particular was always keenly aware. So qualia freaks would have to await their own Darwin, or Einstein. But provided phenomenology could be kept safely quarantined, the philosophical problem of intentionality was thought by many to have been solved. Theories of this kind have the added benefit of building a connection between thought and its objects into the very nature of representational content. Concepts are individuated by the objects or property instantiations whose presence is lawfully, causally correlated with their occurrence, and thus acquire their contents and their extensions simultaneously. Nonetheless, in spite of their promise, causal informational theories have from the start faced serious internal difficulties. For example, they don't seem to be well suited to explain the contents of mathematical, logical, and other concepts whose reference are abstract, causally inert objects, or the contents of concepts of non-existent objects, which have no reference at all. This problem might be addressed by attempting to construct such concepts out of concepts of concrete existent objects. But even if this could be done, there's still a fundamental problem of indeterminacy that besets the causal informational, and I should add teleological, approach as applied to concepts of concrete objects as well as perceptual states. As many have pointed out, causal relations, broadly construed, between the brain and the world are insufficient to determine conceptual or perceptual content, even the actual and possible proliferation of distinct causes of conceptual and perceptual states. The theory doesn't give us a way to sort, to use Gary Fodor's terminology, normal representational state tokenings from wild ones. Phenomenality, I think, has come to the rescue here. Though there may be a robust role for causation to play in the determination of reference in some cases, phenomenology, both conceptual and perceptual, that determines fine-grained, determinate, intentional content, at least as construed in the narrow sense, which, as I said, I think is the only sense. In fact, I think that the wide-narrow content distinction can't be sustained given that it rests on intuitions, the externalist intuitions, that I think are unsupported by the standard considerations, that is, the Putnam and Burge thought experiment. So, in my view, all intentional content is internally phenomenally determined, and psychosemantics, as well as derivatively linguistic semantics, is a branch of analytic phenomenology. The study of the mind and of meaning is the study of experience and must at least begin from the first-person perspective. Moreover, this study may be profitably pursued independently of empirical science, as well as of the distinctly unprofitable philosophical project of reductive mind-body metaphysics. That's it. Hey, Deb.
All right. Thanks. And Brandon Ashby will be commenting. Brandon, did you want me to make you host? Do you have something to share, or are you good just to comment?
You're muted.
Brandon, are you there?
Sorry about that. I was talking to myself. I do have a handout.
Okay, so I'll just make you host then, and then when you're done, you can convert it back to me.
Okay.
I have to step away for just a minute, but I'll be right back.
Why is it not? There we go. Okay. Can everyone see the outline?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I'm just going to wait for David if that's okay. Is that okay, or do you want me to start?
Oh, no. Go ahead and wait.
Okay. We do want to ask Deb Tollefson why she's wearing a University of Tennessee hat.
because I'm paying someone's tuition there. So I thought I should, give
them
wear
more
the
money.
hat they gave me.
Oh, yeah, okay.
All right. I just want to say thank you to David Gray for organizing the conference, and also just for giving me a chance to speak to everyone, and also for to David Pitt for his paper. It's really interesting stuff. So I take it that the main goal that what Pitt wants out of his paper and his project more generally is he wants to motivate us to set aside reductive physicalism, its discontents and related downstream projects, and just focus on the phenomenology itself. He takes on 3 critical targets in the paper. One is this idea that somehow consciousness is ontologically under suspicion and that it's going to need to earn its keep through physical reduction. The second is this idea that the mind-body problem has priority over everything else. We have to figure out if we can physically reduce consciousness before we can really move on to other questions about it, or before we can use consciousness as a tool in solving other problems. And his third target, I take it, is separatism. It's this idea that the phenomenality and intentionality of our experiences are only contingently related to one another. David Papineau, in his recent Defenses of the View, draws a comparison with the semantic and typographical properties of words. The fact that water means water has nothing to do with the color or the type font that I use or the size of the font. On Pitt's alternative program, it's phenomenality and not physically implemented computation that serves as the foundation for all things mental. And as a result, the problem of physical reduction, it doesn't necessarily go away, but it does fade in importance. It's secondary now. And one nice upshot of this is that we no longer need to feel the pressure to separate intentionality from phenomenality in order to save it. It earns its ontological keep through its relationship to consciousness, just like all other mental phenomena. And as Pitt notes, this has pretty radical consequences for all of cognitive science. To quote, the empirical study of the brain is relevant only insofar as it can help us understand experience, which is not open to objective scrutiny. Disciplined introspection sets the task for neuroscience, not vice versa. And his principal argument is just that we as philosophers and also neuroscientists and cognitive science more generally just haven't made progress on the hard problem. It is, for the foreseeable future, a mug's game. So let's just move on and study consciousness in its own right. I sympathize with Pitt's motivations, but I want to suggest a more ecumenical alternative that is itself motivated by experience throughout. I'm going to suggest that physicalism itself isn't the issue, it's objectivity. That the mind-body problem deserves a central place even within analytic phenomenology. I want to suggest that some limited progress on the mind-body problem is possible, and that this opens up the possibility of a dialogue where introspective phenomenology and the empirical sciences inform one another. I want to take up Thomas Nagel's view of the mind-body problem. I'm not going to defend it just because of time. But for Nagel, the mind-body problem is fundamentally about a rift between our subjective and objective concepts. He writes, the physical is a substitute for objectivity in posing the mind-body problem, which arises also for a dualist theory of mind. The question of how one can include in the objective world a mental substance having subjective properties is as acute as the question of how a physical substance can have subjective properties. And he gives us other examples of this objective-subjective rift, the meaning of life, the problem of free will, personal identity, and the divide between consequentialist and agent-based theories of morality. And the upshot is that the mind-body problem, it's not about providing a physical ontology for consciousness. It's the problem of providing any ontology at all. Now, this actually could allow Pitt to make an even stronger argument, which is namely that it's not just neuroscience here and now that's in trouble. It's a scientific understanding of consciousness in general that's not going to work. And as a result, what other choice do we have but to appeal to phenomenology? But as we're going to see, that actually wasn't Nagel's conclusion from this. And we'll come back to that shortly. But first, I want to suggest why the mind-body problem still matters, even on a phenomenology-first approach. The reason has to do with our experiences of ourselves as agent. We experience ourselves as acting for reasons that include what it's like to be us. So when I eat junk food, I eat it because of the experiences that it gives rise to in me. It's not because I somehow think that Cheetos are good for me or that I have a duty to eat them. But then when you consider my zombie twin, he's physically and functionally just like me. The only difference between him and I is that there's nothing that it's like to be him. And he lacks those reasons. For him, we just get a mechanical explanation. And one of the things that I think gets lost a lot of times in the discussion of zombies is the kind of vertigo that this gives us in thinking about our own behavior, because zombie behavior violates these deep-seated intuitions that we have that our experiences matter both to the rational and the mechanical aspects of our behavior, and that these two aspects, they're unified. So we don't experience our subjective selves as kind of issuing orders to our bodies that then execute those orders in objective space. And we don't experience this kind of happy coincidence between our subjective desires and what our bodies happen to do. We experience our bodies as moving through an objective space for entirely subjective reasons. And without a solution to the mind-body problem, we just don't know how consciousness can participate in an objective world order, be it physical or otherwise. Now, the point that I'm making here isn't that the causal efficacy of consciousness is under suspicion. It's that we can't do justice to the richness of our own experiences of ourselves as agents without a solution to the mind-body problem. Our agential experiences, they promise us that consciousness is causally efficacious, but they don't tell us how. And insofar as these agential experiences are central to how we understand ourselves as conscious agents, the mind-body problem should take on a significant, although not authoritarian, importance, even on a phenomenology first view. Now, Nagel's discussion of consciousness in the 1970s, it put consciousness back on the map in analytic philosophy. But he made a suggestion towards the end of what is it like to be a bat that largely got forgotten. He writes, one might try to develop concepts that could be used to explain to a person blind from birth what it is like to see. One would reach a blank wall eventually, but it should be possible to devise a method of expressing, in objective terms, much more than we can at present, and with much greater precision. The loose intermodal analogies, for example, red is like the sound of a trumpet, are of little use, but structural features of perception might be more accessible to objective description, even though something would be left out. Importantly, he says, concepts alternative to those we learn in the first person may enable us to arrive at a kind of understanding even of our own experience, which is denied to us by the very ease of description and lack of distance that subjective concepts afford. In other words, if our entire goal is simply to understand the phenomenal better, to get a deeper understanding of that, Nagel wants to suggest that actually by trying to pursue what he calls an objective phenomenology, we can do that better. And he's not alone. David Chalmers is also somewhat cautiously optimistic about phenomenal structure and making limited progress on the hard problem. He says, in facing up to the problem of consciousness, in general, certain facts about structures found in processing will correspond to and arguably explain facts about the structure of experience. But neither Nagel nor Chalmers say much about what phenomenal structure is. And I want to just sketch an approach to this, which I call phenomenal schematics. And this is the idea that the phenomenal characters of our experiences have an argument structure that is akin to the grammar of a language or the rules of composition for the representational elements and maps and models and diagrams. And that these argument structures constrain the possible contents of our experiences. And the claim is easiest to understand through an example. So if I push my index finger into my palm at different angles, there's two different components or aspects to my pressure experiences. There's one corresponding to the felt direction of force, and there's another corresponding to the felt degree of force. And so I take it if we want to formally model our pressure experiences, we need to use vectors. They have a vectorial structure. But our temperature experiences, on the other hand, they only come in degrees. There's no directionality component to them. And so if we wanted to formally model them, we need to use directionless magnitudes. They have a scalar structure. The upshot is that temperature experiences are poorly suited to represent pressures because they don't have the kind of dual component structure that they would need to represent a direction and a degree of force. Moreover, pressure experiences are going to be poorly suited to represent temperatures. The vectorial structure of pressure experiences are intimately related to our own experiences of our bodies. We experience pressures as deforming the resting state of the body. But we can resist or overcome those pressures with specific bodily actions that depend on the force and the degree and the direction and the location of the pressure. But there's no sense in which our bodily actions can resist or overcome temperatures themselves. I mean, we can move closer to or away from a heat source, but I can't overcome the heat somehow through bodily action, through bodily force. And so if we used pressure experiences to represent temperatures, we would just end up fundamentally mischaracterizing the relationship between temperature and bodily action. Now, to say that phenomenal structure can kind of place these constraints on content doesn't necessarily mean that phenomenal structure alone is going to determine content. So take my temperature spectrum inverted twin. What it's like for him to feel warm things is what it's like for me to feel cool things, and vice versa. Now, maybe one way that we can interpret that case is that my twin's cold experiences represent warmth, and vice versa. You don't have to go that way, but you could. But the important point for now, at least, is that we can't imagine coherently a temperature-pressure invert. I don't have a twin for whom what it's like to feel pressures is what it's like for me to feel temperatures, and vice versa. And more broadly, the idea is that different experiences play different kinds of roles in composing what it's like to be us at a time. And these different roles are, I want to argue, best understood syntactically. But that means that they should admit of computational explanation. Now, there is still a mind-body problem for experiences with equivalent structure. I don't claim to have an account of why it is that we have warm experiences when exposed to warm things as opposed to cool experiences. But arguably, we can explain structural differences between temperature and pressure experiences, if Chalmers is right, by appealing to processing structures in the brain about how those properties get computed. And I just want to point out that this reduction, it's not a threat to a phenomenology first approach to the mind, because the argument for phenomenal schematics, it's thoroughly rooted in our intuitions about consciousness and in introspection. And one, I think, nice thing that I think can actually complement analytic phenomenology here is that Nabel claimed that, sort of objective phenomenology would help us better understand our own experiences. And the concepts of a vector and a scalar, these are mathematical concepts, so I think they're arguably best understood as objective concepts. But I think it's also fair to say that in applying them to our pressure and temperature experiences, we do learn at least a little bit more about what it's like to be us. We can see a little bit more richness in our own experiences. The takeaway from all of this is that, for one thing, I think our experiences may be open to at least some kinds of objective scrutiny, contrary to what Pitt wants to emphasize. That said, analytic phenomenologists do gain an additional argument against separatism. It's simply false that any old experience can represent any old thing. But of course, diehard computationalists also profit too. They don't have to be afraid of at least all aspects of consciousness, at least these structural aspects they can take on board, even though I think they should take on board more than that. And finally, we do get maybe the beginnings of a story about how phenomenology can connect up with behavior, because computation is all about syntax and causal efficacy. And insofar as phenomenal argument structure is a syntactic phenomenon, it might allow us to better understand how at least the kind of structural aspects of our experiences could play a role in behavior. And so more broadly, what I want to suggest is that we can take on board many of Pitt's motivations, we can acknowledge his frustrations and take up his goals, but adopt a kind of more ecumenical approach in which cognitive science and introspective phenomenology kind of reach out to one another in a mutually informing dialogue, rather than needing to dictate terms to one another. So, thank you.
So I do have a short response. I'd like to start by thanking Brandon for his comments, which are very helpful. And I've spent pretty much the last 20 years of my life seeing how much I could get away with and seeing how far I could push this stuff. And I'm always open to being shown that it can't go as far as I want it to go. So I am temporarily, at least, somewhat chastened by Brandon's comments, but I'm not deterred. So I just want to read a response. I should start by saying that the issue I'm focusing on is the relationship between neural activity in the brain and conscious experience. We know that consciousness happens because of what happens in the brain. Mind-body problem, as I understand it, is centrally the problem of explaining how this is even possible. So it's paradoxical. It's actual, we know that, but we don't understand how it could possibly be true. I'm not committed to saying that science can't tell us anything of value about consciousness. Indeed, it's science that tells us that consciousness arises in the brain and not, for example, the heart. That conscious visual experience arises in a certain part of the brain, which receives electrical impulses from photoreceptors from the retinas. That conscious auditory experience arises in a different part of the brain, which receives electrical impulses from mechanoreceptors in the cochlea, etc. But neuroscience and ultimately physics at present offers no explanation of why neural activity results in consciousness. It is, moreover, very hard to see how more of the same, that is, more details along the same lines, for example, even about wave function collapses in nanotubules, could help. Getting small, as we ought to have learned from Descartes, doesn't make the metaphysical problem go away. Now, some of my comments are keyed to the written out version of Brandon's comments, and so there might be some slight mismatch here. So, but after reviewing Nagel's reasons for thinking that science can't explain consciousness, Brandon writes, quote, consequently, Pitt's claims that neuroscience does nothing to explain consciousness could be made about any possible scientific approach to consciousness. This would allow Pitt to make a stronger argument for his view. Phenomenology should come first because a scientific understanding of consciousness is beyond hope, unquote. I should note that I don't agree with Nagel that subjectivity is the problem. And I don't think the scientific understanding of consciousness is impossible. My argument is that science as we have it hasn't explained it, and that it's very hard to see how it could in the absence of a fundamental shift in its approach. I don't think that, to quote Brandon, quote, phenomenology should come first because a scientific understanding of consciousness is beyond hope, unquote. I should also note that I think the phrase scientific understanding of consciousness is very broad and ambiguous. So as I just noted, science has helped us to understand some facts about conscious experience. What I'm concerned with is, at bottom, the explanation of why it exists at all, and why it is different depending on where in the brain it's generated, given the essential sameness of the inputs. Brandon also writes that, quote, zombies violate the deep-seated intuition that what it's like to be us matters both to the rational and to the mechanical aspects of our behaviors, and importantly, that these two aspects are unified, unquote. I confess I don't really see the problem here. Zombies don't act for reasons. What they do is act exactly like people who act for reasons, just as they act exactly like people who have conscious visual experiences, even though they don't. I also don't see why it should be true that, as Brandon puts it, quote, we cannot do justice to the richness of our own experiences ourselves as agents until we address the mind-body problem, unquote. We can take it as given that our conscious states are rooted in physical states of the brain, which can be responsible for the causation of behavior, while acknowledging that we don't have a clue how consciousness is so rooted. Brandon objects that this sort of approach, quote, raises the mind-body problem without solving it. Since our agential experiences occupy a central place in how we understand ourselves as conscious subjects, the mind-body problem should remain a significant, outstanding problem, even on a phenomenology first review, unquote. In response, I agree that the mind-body problem is important, but this is consistent with thinking that at present, it's a waste of time to try to solve it. Brandon also suggests that objective investigation can help us pin down certain structural features of conscious experiences of different kinds. I have no doubt that this is true. But the real problem is, as Brandon just noted, and maybe I missed it in the written out version of this, the real problem is with the contents that fill those structures. This is what actually brought down functionalism as a theory of consciousness, right? That structural relations don't give you qualitative content. Finally, Brandon says that he wants to resist my claims that, quote, introspection should dictate terms to neuroscience and that experience is not open to objective scrutiny, unquote. Again, I haven't based my argument on the subjectivity of conscious experience. What I mean when I say that introspection should take the lead is that the explanandum for the neuroscience of the conscious mind is given to us introspectively. Introspection gives us the data we need to explain in the first place.
All right. Thanks. Brandon, could you re-host me?
Brandon's in charge now.
Yes, it's
Apologies. Give me one.
Oh.
Sorry, how do I convert host status?
You go to my setting and you go to more, I believe, and then I think there's a choice to make me host.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, if you would, I guess, like to have a comment, you can either raise your hand right now, and we'll start with someone, and then everyone else should just privately. So let's start with Bronwyn. I see her hand first, and everyone else who has a question should just privately message me in the chat, and then I'll make a list.
I think Michelle was before me. If
Oh,
she
was
wants
Michelle?
to go,
Oh, okay.
If she messaged.
Go ahead, Bronwyn. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much for. I really enjoyed the talk and the comments. Super engaging. I wanted to ask a little bit, David, about the prospects for linguistic semantics. I totally agree. I'm totally on board with defining, making sense of linguistic meaning in terms of the structure of thought. But I was wondering whether you really want to go, like, how much of a place because you kind of offhandedly mentioned Grice as being like, well, we don't want to define it in terms of communication, right? And while I agree in one sense, I was just wondering if you think there's room for a view according to which relationships with others does play a part in that semantics via deference, right? So, of course, we.
Right, I missed what one phrase. It does play a part. What you said something about deference?
Oh, deference. So I mean, I'm wondering if we can give us a linguistic semantics in terms of the meanings of thoughts, but leave room for the role of others. So on this view, what the content of my thought in some cases is. It ultimately is phenomenological, but part of that phenomenology has something like what I mean by supervenience. Part of that phenomenal character actually is deferential in the sense that I mean whatever part of my meaning, and I acknowledge this in my thought, is whatever David means by supervenience, and in that way. And so it's not quite a communication theoretic view of meaning, but it really necessarily, well, not necessarily, let's say nomologically in our case, leaves room for others and a lot of the thoughts of others in giving a proper semantics.
Yeah, I don't want to go there for the following reason. Look, I think that the meanings of the words that I use can be determined in the language by other speakers. And I think actually, in my own case, I not very rarely, but especially if I use big words, because I love big words and different words, the subtle nuances between them are not really part of what I'm thinking. But my utterance means what it means in the language, and that's not determined by me. But I don't, unless you think that thinking is just internal speaking, I don't see how what somebody else thinks is going to determine what the content of my current conscious state is in the way you're suggesting.
So you think that your words, so you think that what words mean do depend on, like, you don't have control over what words means. So
In general, right? No, you don't. You can't just decide that glory means a nice knockdown argument in English. It
Well,
doesn't.
you can't. Well,
But it is up to me, in a sense, what I'm thinking. And it might very well be the case that what I'm thinking when I utter the word supervenience isn't what the word means in English or in philosophies.
Okay, I guess now I'm confused about then how, like, I wish I had the exact quote, but you said something about like the role of linguistic semantics ultimately being tied up with looking at the structure of thought.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be, there's still going to be some downstream. So linguistic meaning then is a downstream result of the nature and structure of thought. Is that
right? But
right?
But even if we're talking about the meaning of a term in the language, it is in general determined by mental content, even if not mind.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
There's some
So
sort of
yeah.
consensus about
Right.
which mental content this expression
Right.
expresses.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Okay, I think I'm probably just not being as clear as I would like to be, but for what it's worth, where I'm going here is that, and this maybe is pertinent to some of Brandon's work as well, as I've been really interested in using the tools of mental state discourse representation, which is built off, it's a way of modeling mental states that I think could work really nicely with a phenomenal intentionality program and give systematicity, and it's computationally viable if you want to go computationalist, but it is formal. So that's what I'm thinking, and you can get the linguistic semantics out of the mental states, but it does leave room for communal mental states, the role of the mental states.
Yeah, so I would want to resist any kind of anything in the Burge-Putnam part of the universe.
Oh, it's not Burge-Putnam.
Because it kind of sounds like the division of linguistic labor.
No.
Burge becomes division of conceptual labor, and I don't buy that.
Yeah, it's slightly different. It's from the work of it's linguistic semantics, Hans Kamp's sort of stuff. So.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, well, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, next, Michelle.
Mine is just I love the chapter. I'm very much looking forward to the book, David.
Thank you.
I'm
very much looking forward to and dreading finishing it.
This is just a comment that Brentano is definitely in agreement with you. He makes a distinction between descriptive psychology and genetic psychology. Mm-hmm. And descriptive psychology is just describing our experiences from the first person. And that's the fundamental philosophy of mind, because it's describing the target. And without accurately describing the target, we just don't know what we're talking about. Even if genetic psychology can tell us stuff about how, conscious states might be related to the brain, it's just not going to describe the target. So I just wanted to point out Brentano's.
So you think I should put in a Brentano reference?
Yeah, I think it would be nice, because I was just pointing out that he agrees with you.
Well, Husserl does too. I mean, insofar as anyone understands Husserl.
Yeah.
And I start out with talking about Husserl Phenomenology by Husserl.
I would definitely put a reference to Brentano then, because he often gets passed over for Husserl. Yeah. Really, Brentano is sort of, the Mac Daddy of.
He's the dude. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And it's the stuff is to be found in Psychology from an empirical standpoint.
Yeah, I can send you a reference.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Thank you. As we say in California, that would be awesome.
All right. Next is Zach.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting talk. I still remain a bit worried about this stark contrast, however, between a phenomenological study of consciousness and maybe a third-person neuroscientific study of consciousness. I'm not sure that it's always the case that the neuroscience won't be able to help us inform our studies of phenomenology. And one example that I have is, part of our phenomenological experience is that it seems like we're moving forward in time in a unidirectional way. It's just a straight line forward. But what the neuroscience tells us is that there are all different ways that is produced by the brain, and sometimes we can be subject to illusions. There's one task, I don't know if you've ever seen this task, but in an experimental paradigm, but where you have a dot, and rapidly after, and it's colored, and rapidly afterwards, there's another dot that shows up on the screen nearby it, and it's a different color. What you experience is, in between those two dots, you see a transitional dot. Yeah, the color phi phenomenon. Yeah, you see a transitional dot, which is not there on the screen. Your brain is filling it in. But it's part of your phenomenal experience. So what the neuroscience shows us is sometimes what we think our phenomenology is like is subject to illusion. So it seems that neuroscience can in ways inform us about our phenomenology in ways that introspection and will not be able to inform us of.
So yeah, I agree with that. And like I said, I'm trying to see how rabid I can be about some of this stuff. So the kind of example I thought about a lot is shape constancy in perception, and the question of whether shape constancy is perceptual or doxastic, basically. So does it really look, does the Frisbee look round even when its projection is elliptical, right? And there are, classic sort of introspectionist psychology bottlenecks where yes, it is, no, it isn't, yes. And I think, well, an empirical psychologist ought to be able to come up with an experiment that can decide that question, right? So if it really is that the background assumption is that objects don't change their shape just because they're moving, if you remove that assumption and you somehow design an experiment that removes it, you should be able to answer that question. So I definitely think that empirical science can help us answer questions about experience, but it's experience that it can help us answer questions about, and it can't answer the question why there's experience at all, which is what philosophers have. This is obviously not to a person, but which has been sort of the central obsession of philosophy, is how to give a physicalistically or naturalistically kosher explanation of consciousness. And the rallying cry here, which may be a bit too loud and overstated, is that that's not going to happen. Stop. You're wasting your time. Maybe 1,000 years from now, when our Einstein or Darwin comes along, or maybe McGinn's right, it's just beyond us. But in any case, you're wasting your time now. It's hopeless for us now. And so what should we do instead? Well, and maybe I should temper it to say, here's a really good thing you could do instead. Just study experience. And which is not to say, so what I think empirical science isn't going to help us with at all as presently constituted is the fundamental, why is there experience at all? And why is it different when you have this as opposed to this, which seems like a joke, right? Set that aside. Doesn't mean setting empirical science aside, but it means setting the mind-body problem aside. And part of doing that is, look, philosophers haven't explained the relation, and neither is neuroscience. Neuroscience hasn't. I definitely need to make this clear. Neuroscience hasn't explained it either, right? So it's not that we should turn away from neuroscience, but we should turn away from neuroscience as providing an answer to that question: why there's experience at all, and why it's different in the way it is, given the sameness of input. So that's really helpful. I'm definitely going to change the way I say things.
All right, thanks. Next is David Henderson.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's quite interesting. But perhaps inadvisedly, given my ignorance and relative lack of competence in this area, I want to rise to the defense of zombies. I don't know, I'm not the best spokesman for zombies because A,
You're not
I'm
one.
and B, I don't know of any, and C, I don't even know whether any are possible. But it seems to me, so far as I can tell, given the open aspect of the hard question, that I don't have any positive reason to suppose that there couldn't be, and that those zombies couldn't act for reasons. So I am in favor of the kind of investigation that you're urging, but I don't know why I should think it's investigation of phenomenology and reasons as those are connected in a class of critters that have some range of similar both physical and evolutionary lineages. So I have no reason to suppose, until I get a better story about content and reasons, that I'm sure is not saying, oh, we know it because this is how it is for us. And so it just feels to me like this is an argument for ignorance. I think we can do a lot without addressing the question of zombies and their lack of reasons, and without presupposing that all reasons are feely-like things. So that's just my immature.
Yeah, I join you in ignorance about action theory and acting for reasons. And I was just sort of accepting the terms of Brandon's discussion and saying, well, look, they're acting just like us. Aren't they acting for reasons? Well, not necessarily, right? They're acting just like us. Then aren't they acting on the basis of their visual experience? Well, my hypothesis, no, they're not. Right. So I think it's open to someone to respond to Brandon by saying, well, right, they don't have reasons. They're not acting for reasons. And it's not just they're not acting for reasons in the way that we do. So it's not so much that I'm defending this position, because like you, I don't really know enough about the ins and outs of these things. But I'm saying that, yeah, well, we could just say, it's a defensible position, at least to start with, to say that just like they don't have visual experiences, they don't have reasons. And Declan Smithies has this gigantic book,
Yeah.
Epistemic Significance of Consciousness, which I will never read all of, but I think he talks a lot about it in there. So I'll appeal to authority that there's a way to make sense of it. But yeah,
I have read it all, and
you've read it all.
Yes, it's a lovely book, and
he writes beautifully.
Does.
Yeah, and he's really, really good. He's a really good philosopher.
In fact, I pressed him on this point because I thought he was too dismissive of zombies. And what we all tend to do is we start with close by cases to us and manage some deficits for critters like us, and then move to, with those deficits, you wouldn't have reason for this, therefore zombies wouldn't. And that seems to me a bad way of arguing from the point of view of a space of logical possibilities.
Perhaps.
I thought your poo-pooing of zombies came up in your talk proper rather than just in responding to Brandon.
Did it? Maybe it did, but I wasn't talking about acting for reasons, because I know my limits.
Was it having reasons?
What?
Was that
or having reasons?
Yeah.
So, look, if you can act for reasons that you're not aware of and that you don't appreciate, then zombies can act for reasons.
and aware
And
of.
that's not an aspect of mentality that is that requires consciousness. Or I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that. I just said it. I don't want to. So yeah, then I would say that no, I'd have to say something that sounds false, which is that acting for reasons isn't a mental phenomenon. So I'd have to say, no, you can't act for reasons without being aware of them and appreciating them. Yeah, I know. I don't have a dog in this race.
Okay, let's see.
Maybe I do.
Let's see. I think Deb said she had a follow-up. Is this follow-up or you?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't that just presuppose that cognitive phenomenology, that phenomenal intentionality is true? Aren't you just begging the question?
I'm trying not to. I mean, not that I'm trying not to. I'm not trying to beg the question. So it's not like I'm saying, well, you have to be able to think, and thinking is a kind of, I'd be arguing for my own position if I said, look, zombies can't act for reasons because in order to act for reasons, you have to be able to think, and thinking is a conscious experience, and zombies don't have that, so zombies don't think, right? That wouldn't be begging the question if I've got a good argument that thinking is a kind of experience. And I think I do. I think I've got a couple of them, right? So it's arguing for my own theory. It would be arguing for my own theory, but I have reasons for accepting the theory that I do. But that's a good question. It's helpful. Terry's finger. Mute. David, can you unmute him?
All right.
There we go.
Got it now? All right. Sorry. Also, a follow-up. I just wanted to point out that there's a line of thinking in philosophy of mind that could be injected here in support, for example, of the kind of skepticism that David Henderson was voicing. And that is to lean on the Ned Block distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. For somebody who thinks that there really is an intelligible way to understand access consciousness that can lack phenomenality, then presumably that would be some sort of functional story, like, wide broadcast within the cognitive system is a key idea for access consciousness. To the extent that somebody is a fan of the notion of access consciousness without phenomenality, and thinks that certain access conscious states play suitable reasonish roles in cognition and in generation of behavior, they can say that zombies act for reasons. They will say, presumably, that zombies are access conscious of reasons and access conscious of reason involving states, even though those states don't have phenomenality. And so I think important part of the overall dialectic for fans of phenomenal intentionality is to push back against the idea of access conscious states that are not phenomenally conscious. That's an issue looming here.
Yeah, so I think Ned was trying to clear up a confusion that some people were using the term conscious to mean this, and philosophers are using it to mean this, and they're talking past each other. And I haven't actually asked him about this, but I assume, and at least my view is, yeah, what they're calling consciousness just isn't consciousness at all, right? Access consciousness isn't a form of consciousness. So I just don't believe in it, and I think it's been the source of great mischief, right? So people can think they can solve problems by saying, oh, but it's access consciousness. Yeah, but that's not consciousness, right? And I should say now in response to David, because of Deb's prodding, that I do have a view on this all of a sudden. Right? That zombies can't act for reasons because they can't think, and they can't think because they don't have experience, and thinking is a kind of experience. So that I have a position now. Thank you, both of you.
Okay, I think Michelle, and then Deb again, and then after that, I'd like to insert myself in there too. But let's start with Michelle.
This is just a quick point. I have asked Ned, and his intention never was to say that there were two kinds of consciousness.
That's what I thought. Thank you. And he doesn't use that term anymore. Yeah.
Quickly, if zombies can't act for reasons, then they can't act. So would you say that what you have there is a kind of behavior that, yeah, it's like
if you want to connect action versus behavior with having reasons and acting for reasons, then I would, to be consistent, I would say they're not acting, they're just behaving.
Yeah.
Good point.
Okay, I guess I'll jump in here. So I was a little curious by your response to Brandon about not really wanting to put the mind-body problem in terms of a subjective-objective distinction. And one reason I thought that I was a bit curious is I thought that's a really nice distinction for explaining what you might think a lot of your opponents are doing incorrectly. So, just to take a couple examples, the fundamental project of science is explanation. You might think that explanation is going to be fundamentally representational, and maybe they're conflating what a good explanation of thought is with just what thought is. And one way to talk about that would be that, well, yeah, a good explanation of thought has to be representational to some extent, but an explanation of thought doesn't have to be representational. And if you're talking about phenomenology, it seems that's going to be one problem, is that it's hard to give a subjective account an objective explanation. And so that might be one sort of thing that an objective account is useful for, or using that kind of way of explaining things.
So, yeah, I think that even if you could take the experience of red out of a mind and put it on a lab bench, there'd still be a real mystery about how what's going on in the brain produced that thing, just because of the sort of the qualitative difference between them. And so for me, the problem is, there's an obstacle to studying consciousness scientifically, because you have to study it indirectly, as things now stand. But look, so someone like Sam Coleman thinks that phenomenal qualities are objective properties and they don't depend on a point of view. And I would say, yeah, but they're still like it. And if you're presented with what I think is really overwhelming evidence that the reason this property is instantiated is that something's going on in your brain, even if your head turned, well, no, not that, but you've got this experiential property, and you have this acquaintance with it. It allows you to really know what it is, and then you look at what's causing it, or what it's the result of. And even if you could access those properties objectively, I still think there would be a great puzzle. And it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that we only have subjective access to them.
I guess I'm wondering, so for instance, you don't think that you can have unconscious phenomenal experiences, right?
I don't know.
Well, if
I tend to think that it's not conceptually incoherent.
Oh,
but
okay.
When you say this to people, they say, "What's your argument?" And I try to come up with an argument, and they all get defeated. Well, not all of them, but they're problematic. So look, the easiest way out in my giant project, the easiest way out is, well, what do you say about unconscious thoughts? Well, it's unconscious phenomenology. Next question, right? But there's so much resistance to that idea, which I don't really have a problem with. And I know other people who don't have a problem with it either. But because there's such resistance, I thought maybe I should have some arguments for that. And the arguments haven't really convinced anybody. So I'm thinking, okay, well, fine, let's say that's true. Could we do what we need to do without unconscious phenomenology? That is, without unconscious thought.
I mean, if you're not, I think it's okay if you want to say there is an unconscious phenomenology, but that would be, I think that's again why the subjective objective distinction is important here. You just can't put red patches out on a lab bench.
Yeah, but I'm saying even if you could, there would still be a mystery. So
Yeah.
it's the subjective objective distinction is a distinction in the kinds of access that we have to these properties. It's not a distinction well, Searle might argue that it is a distinction, an ontological distinction, but Nagel, I don't think Nagel thinks. Nagel definitely doesn't think that, because he doesn't conclude that phenomenal properties aren't physical. He just concludes that we don't understand how they could be.
Yeah, I would just think that the fact that we normally think of scientific explanations or any kind of explanations at all as things that are, accessible and observable to all is one of those things that explains a lot of perhaps reductivist projects, right? I mean, you have reductivist projects that are explanatory, but sometimes people confuse that for some type of ontological reduction or elimination of the phenomenal. I don't know, like maybe David Armstrong, for instance, when he tries to explain pain sensations in terms of, it appearing to you as if your body's damaged. I mean, that's an explanation, but it wouldn't explain why there isn't pain, for instance, or why you'd have to even be a reductionist about it. So I guess that's along the lines that I was thinking, is that maintaining a kind of strong objective-subjective distinction would be another way to kind of explain why the phenomenological is going to be ineliminable in these kind of cases.
So I'm not sure I followed everything you said, but it seems to me that you can give a reductive explanation of complex experiences. And if you're a panpsychist, right, you might think you could give sort of an ontological reduction of experiences, but only to other experiences. And of course, reductive explanation is the only kind, but it's the kind we look at when we see the kind of explanations that have been given for all the other stuff about us that, are way our bodies work and life itself. That's the kind of explanation we look for. But I don't think reductive means objective or physical. It just means explaining facts in terms of more basic facts, or at least other facts.
Yeah, I take it insofar as we're explaining, though, or at least in those kind of cases like Armstrong, one of the reasons to try to explain phenomenology in terms of intentionality is that, representations are something that are quite easily, in a way, observable for everybody, right? And insofar as we have a grasp on of intentionality, for instance. And so I guess my thought was that you can explain phenomenology in intentional terms.
You're saying you can?
Huh?
You're saying you can?
Oh, I'm saying you can give an explanation of phenomenology in intentional terms. What I'm saying is, even if that's successful,
you can try.
That's no reason to assume that there isn't phenomenology.
Okay. I'm kind of losing track of your main point.
I guess I was just thinking that, things like, for instance, pain sensations are going to be what we think of as subjective experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so part of the project of, kind of hardline intentionalists is to give representational accounts of things things like phenomenology, which seem subjective. And so part of that is making the phenomenology more friendly to scientific explanation.
Well, right. So if you said that, that the redness we experience is a physical feature of the objects we're perceiving, yeah, that makes that problem go away. But you just can't do that. I mean, that program I think, fails pretty miserably on the existence of dreams and hallucinations. So they say, oh, the blue you experience when you look at the sky, that's a property of the sky, not of your experience. And then you'd say, well, what about it if I'm hallucinating? Oh, it's the same thing, only there's no blue in the sky. Where is it then? And Lycan would say, it's instantiated in another possible world. Yeah, those are inaccessible to me. Or Dvoretsky says, oh, it's an uninstantiated universal. They don't look like anything. Well, having an experience of blue. So I have this little paper called the paraphenomenal hypothesis, in which I say, look, it's an absurdity. It's like that old joke. You know, how do you explain the telephone? It's like you got the gigantic dog with his head in Brooklyn and a tail in the Bronx. Okay, well, what about radio? How does that work? Oh, it's the same thing, only you don't have the dog, right? It's funny because it's absurd, because it can't be the same thing if you don't have the dog. So saying like, oh, well, hallucination is the same thing as veridical perception, only the blue isn't instantiated. But the instantiated blue was supposed to be the qualitative character of your experience, right? As Pai and Burns say, qualia ain't in the head, right? They're the properties of objects that we perceive, and they're brought into the mind, so to speak. The reason it's pertinent to talk about those in describing my mental state is not because my mental state instantiates them, but because my mental state represents them, right? And that's all physicalistically kosher, I suppose, but it just doesn't work.
Okay, so we're, I think I'll talk to you about that later, but we're out of time right now. So
thank you all very much. This has really been helpful. You're going to make me change stuff, so I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks very much for that. I enjoyed it. And so we're going to have a few minutes break now. Our next talk will be at 3:45, so about a 15-minute break. And I will see you back here then. Or David Henderson, if you're there, I can talk to you briefly right now.
Yes.
Yes. So let's see. Oh, right. So you have a PowerPoint. So it's pretty easy. I can just make you the host, which I did right now.
Uh-huh.
And then while you're giving the talk, now you can say share your screen.
Yeah, this part I know. I'm just not used to handing off hosting. So how do I?
Right. So if you click on your participants window, so that's open.
Yeah.
And then scroll over my name and you should see a blue little box that says more.
Yes, got it.
And then you just send it back to me when you're done.
Okay. Well, if we're going to leave it up, I will share my screen now just to have it done, and then we'll be ready.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds good.
Very good.
So here, I don't know if you guys can see this, but here's an internet meme. Trump Tower.
Yeah. I was afraid that was where you were going to put all the zombies because they didn't act for reasons. So what the hell?
No, if they didn't act for reasons, let them go. They're not guilty.
Well, they could be doing bad things. You might want to lock them up.
Well, yeah, but not to punish them, but to protect everyone else.
Yeah.
Right.
David, can I try another? Oh, I'm sorry, David Pitt. Can I try another shot of maybe explaining what I don't think I explained what I was thinking of very well.
Yeah, I don't think I was following what you meant.
Okay, so here's what I'm imagining. I think so people who don't buy into the cognitive phenomenology project, I take it, see the phenomenology as basically not something that has an ontological status or is going to be reducible to the representational. Are you still there, David?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, okay.
Upstaged by the PowerPoint.
Right. Okay. So I take it that something like the game David Armstrong was playing was something like this. It's like, well, there seems to be these phenomenal properties and they're hard to make sense of. So if we can give a nice explanation of them in representational terms, then that's reason to think that really all there is something like representations. And the mere fact that I can give an explanation of the phenomenology in representational terms is proof of this. I don't know, is that how you read Armstrong or not really?
Well, I don't know it from Armstrong. It's good to know that he thought of it. We're talking like 1968 Armstrong, the curious theory. Yeah. I mean, I got this from Ty and Byrne and Dretsky and Lycan.
Okay.
But yeah, if you could do that, well, then you'd be saying that qualia are objective physical properties.
Okay.
But you can't do that, and you can't do it with thought either. I mean, that's another.
Okay.
Right, there's a certain, but the view that Byrne defends that just like Dretsky says, well, you want to know what your experience is like, look at the things you're experiencing. You want to know what you think, well, look at the world. And this idea comes from Evans and developed by Richard Moran. And I don't think that works either for somewhat complicated reasons.
Yeah. So what I'm sort of suggesting is that even if you could give let's just say so I think successful might be misleading here. So successful might mean you've succeeded in reducing the phenomenal to the intentional, and that's not what I mean. Successful, I would take to mean is you've given a full account of the phenomenal.
Well, right, but what really matters is whether the account is true or not.
Well,
here's my full account of respiration. When O2 molecules are breathed into your alveoli, there are these little spirits that, like the Powerpuff Girls, who take the O2 molecules and bring them to all your tissues. And then they bring back the carbon dioxide to be excreted. And that's my account of respiration. Okay, that could be true, but it's not.
So, yes, see, I'm making a different argument than that. I'm saying that even if Armstrong did give a full representational account of what phenomenology is, meaning that, he's explained all the features without remainder, that still doesn't mean that phenomenology is going to be either, well, it still doesn't mean that you can say, what's the word I want to say? Eliminate, I guess, phenomenology.
Well, then I don't see how you could say he's given a complete account without remainder.
Because I take it
because it's an eliminativist approach.
Well, so I take it. Reduction is an explanatory strategy. It's not a metaphysical position, right? The metaphysical position that attaches to it would either have to be identity or elimination.
Right.
Right. So reductive explanation is just explaining one thing's in terms of the other.
Mm-hmm.
But if they're identical, it's possible that, an explanation could go in the other direction. And if another possibility is if you've given a reductive explanation, that might be reasons for thinking that the thing you gave a reductive explanation of doesn't exist. Right. Now it's not completely clear to me which Armstrong thinks.
Oh, well, I don't know about Armstrong because I haven't read that.
Yeah.
But I know that representationalists like Ty, et cetera, they're reductive representationalists without being eliminativists about qualia. They just say qualia are external physical properties.
Yeah. That's weird. But like, yeah. For instance, what you might think of is if you were giving a reductivist explanation about phenomenology, you should end up with your view. If it's not an eliminativist position, right? Because
it depends on what you're trying to reduce it to.
Well, if you're giving a reductive intentional account, right, you're explaining it in terms of representational properties.
Right, but the whole point of doing that is that you want to give a naturalistic account of phenomenology. That's the whole point of that, because we've got this, allegedly, we've got this naturalistic account of conceptual intentionality that we get from Dretsky or maybe Millikan or Karen Neander. And so let's apply that strategy to qualitative experience, and we're going to need a different kind of representational vehicle because of how the obvious differences in detail between conceptual and perceptual representations. But we tell this, if we say that this mental state has this qualitative character, that doesn't mean that it instantiates it. It means it represents it. And then we've got a naturalistic story to tell about representation in general, right? That was the goal of this program. And so, Armstrong's book is called A Materialist Theory of the Mind. But I need to take a break.
Okay.
Sorry, David.
That's all right.
For several